a lot of the policies I looked at in the book come out of very dark periods in these countries' histories. And so you have the National Health Service in the UK where I live, this first universal healthcare system in the world, coming out of the ashes of World War II. You have Estonia looking to the internet to rebuild its country at a time in which, again, it didn't have any resources. Uruguay looking to renewable energy at a point in which it was constantly being plunged into darkness because they couldn't keep the lights on. They couldn't afford to keep buying fossil fuels from neighboring countries at exorbitant prices, and so they had to look for a different solution. And I want us to really hopefully come away from these lessons thinking dark periods can sometimes yield really great solutions, and so we cannot put our hands up in despair, as I said earlier, but put our hands to work and really think of this as a time in which if more and more people are realizing that things are broken, they also are realizing that we need to fix them, that we need to chart a different path forward.
Hey, it's Yulia, and this is Going Places, a show about fascinating places near and far, and the people who make them better. Welcome back to the show, everyone. This is your host, Yulia Denisyuk. Today, we're speaking with Natasha Hakimi Zapata, an award-winning journalist, translator, and university lecturer in Europe. She's also the author of Another World is Possible, Lessons for America from Around the Globe, a book that came out a few months ago and that has given me so much hope and inspiration for the years ahead. The more I travel around the world and see how people and societies arrange themselves in other places, the more I understand that this idea of American exceptionalism, that somehow the United States is the best country on the planet, is frankly a joke. I think it won't take anyone by surprise for me to say that the United States is not a good place to live for so many people. At the root of it is a worldview in which basic services like housing, healthcare, food, and childcare are viewed as commodities to make money on, not human rights, critical for human flourishing. One of the things I often think about these days is this idea that most of us are closer to being homeless than we are to being millionaires, with only one healthcare disaster, a lost job, or another calamity sending us to the brink. Yet, we often still buy into this myth of being self-made in America, working hard and hustling hard to get to a better place one day. It's a promise that hasn't been delivered for so many of us. And in her book, Natasha travels to 9 countries around the world to show how in those places, instead of promising better futures tomorrow, there's already a better present today. Natasha and I met at one of her book events in Chicago this winter, and I immediately knew I wanted to have a deeper conversation with her. We'll talk about what's already working in many places around the world. Natasha traveled to Norway, for example, to look at their generous paid parental leave policies and compare them with the US, which is one of 7 countries on Earth that doesn't provide nationwide statutory paid parental leave. In Singapore, Natasha explored how a very capitalist society was able to pass a policy in which if you're unemployed, you're not going to lose a roof over your head. And in Costa Rica, she looked at the world's first biodiversity law that put the country's nature and environment in the hands of the public. What I found most powerful about Natasha's book is that it not only shows us what's already working in these 9 countries, but what the US can take from them and adapt to our situation. In this episode, we talk about the palpable despair so many of us feel, and a moment of convergence where people from all kinds of walks of life are realizing this is not tenable. We need another way to organize our lives. We talk about what people in the US can do and discuss the choice of moving to another place versus staying here and fighting for it. Natasha's book and our conversation gave me so much hope for this moment, and this is exactly what we're doing on our reimagined Going Places platform. We're cultivating hope. We just launched as a reader and audience supported platform, which means that you can join us and be in community with us on this journey. And thank you so much to all of the members who have already been joining us in the past several weeks. You can become a Going Places member for as little as $6 a month, and there are many perks associated with our membership, like getting on a group call with me every month to ask questions, get advice, and be in community with each other and so many like-minded people. We also share creator opportunities like winning a scholarship to a travel conference in California this August, and much more. Visit goingplacesmedia.com to check it out and see how you can join us. All right, now let's get into this conversation with Natasha. Asha, welcome to the show. I'm so thrilled to have this conversation with you, and I can't wait to get started to talk about your book.
Thank you so much for having me, Yulia.
Let me just say that I really loved your book. And for our listeners, for our viewers, if you haven't yet, please check this book out. It's very special and very relevant right now for our times, for the world we live in. It's called Another World is Possible: Lessons for America from Across the World. And I think for me, it was such a good example of something that I experience again and again as a traveler, that I go outside of the United States and I see that another world is not only possible, but that in a lot of places it's already here, right? And I often feel a great deal of empathy for myself and fellow Americans, and especially Americans who are, less privileged and less fortunate than I am, because in the States, we live in such a highly dysfunctional system that this idea that in the richest country in the world, we struggle with so many basic things, that it's just always blows my mind that, I see it when I come back to the United States, and seeing that in a lot of places around the world, their citizens have not only promises of a better future for tomorrow, but a better deal already today. Can I start by reading an excerpt from lesson 2 that says that we need a society built for many, not the few?
Absolutely. And so just to say, Yulia, that a lot of what you're describing was a big part of the inspiration behind the book. I'm a journalist. I've been a journalist in US media for about 15 years now. And that experience that you're describing is exactly how I felt both traveling abroad and living abroad. I've lived abroad for over 12 years now. And I grew up partly in Mexico City as well. And so I come home with that same feeling and that same empathy that you described, and also just so much frustration, knowing that we can do so much better by our citizens in the US and that we don't. And a lot of that is also linked to a personal story, which I can talk about a little bit later, related to healthcare if we talk about healthcare. And so I'd be more than happy to read. So this is from the conclusion, in which a lot of people would ask me, what are lessons that you collected from all of the countries that you went to? And so I thought that that would be a good place to end the book. And this is lesson number 2. So lesson 2, we need a society built for the many, not the few. The recent pandemic caused many Americans to ask ourselves, sometimes for the first time, what kind of society we truly want to live in. Ultimately, that is the question at the root of all of the policies I examined, from Singapore to New Zealand and Estonia to Costa Rica. Do we want to live in a society like Singapore, where housing is a right? Or like Norway, where working families can expect guaranteed government support to raise their children? Or like Finland, where everyone can count on their neighborhood school offering the best possible education? Or like New Zealand, where people can age without fear of destitution? Or like Estonia, where human rights have been translated for the internet age? Or like Portugal, where addiction is treated as a public health issue rather than criminalized? Or like Uruguay and Costa Rica, where clean energy and biodiversity protections safeguard the planet humans and so many other species depend on? Or like the United Kingdom, where healthcare access is a universal right? America is not working for the majority of us who struggle to pay health and childcare costs, can't afford to buy our own homes, are caught off guard by rising energy costs, are getting sick from the lack of clean air and water, have lost loved ones to opioids and other drugs, have watched many of our public schools fail our children, cannot access public services, cannot survive on Social Security payments, and are anxious about the climate crisis that threatens to engulf our planet. Instead, it's working for a tiny, super rich minority that amassed its wealth on the back of our collective labor and our collective impoverishment.
I love that. And it just, to me, that's when I read that lesson at the end of the book, it just summarized so well sort of the situation that we're in and the time that we're in right now. And this idea that this American dream that America was known for a very long time, it hasn't actually worked for us for a very long time. We're getting a really bad deal here in America.
That's exactly how I put it, and how I really want people to walk away from this book to feel like we are getting a bad deal, and it's a very unnecessarily bad deal. So when we talk about this American dream, I'm the daughter of immigrants. My mom is from Mexico, my dad's from Iran. My mom was undocumented for much of her time in the US, and we grew up, my brothers and I, with this idea of us as these little American dreams that my parents had. And yet, as we got older, and I was the first in my family to get a college degree and all of these big sort of milestones that are part of the American dream. But I started to feel like that American dream was actually more possible in some of the other countries I'd been to or lived in. And a large part of that is the story with healthcare that I was talking about earlier, which I write about in the introduction to the book, where my mom, who couldn't afford health insurance, healthcare for many, many years, had undiagnosed, untreated diabetes that finally was diagnosed at the point in which she was rushed to an emergency room and had to have her right foot amputated. And when she called me, I was in grad school at the time across the country in Boston. She was in Los Angeles. I had this immediate dread, of course, of how is my mom going to survive this? Is she going to be okay? What's her life going to look like after this? But I also had this added dread of how are we going to pay for the care she needs? How are we going to pay for the insulin she needs to literally stay alive? And I knew, because I'd lived in places like the UK where I live now, that there is such a thing as universal healthcare, and that we could, as Anirban Bevan, the founder of the NHS, said, lift the financial burden off of people in their most vulnerable moments. And so these are the kind of stories, and they really come from a very personal place, that I wanted to share with my fellow Americans as we really do think about and talk about what kind of America we want to live in.
It hits home, I think, for so many of us. I think every single one of us living in the States has a terrible experience with healthcare here. And it's, like I said, it's the dread that is always on your shoulders. I read somewhere recently this phrase, we are much closer to being homeless than to being millionaires. And that really hit home, because it's literally like we're walking one disaster away, one health emergency away from becoming the least supported and the least, lucky and franchised level of our society. And it's just, it puts it into such a perspective why so many people are so stressed and so just absolutely frenzied here in the United States when you don't have that social support, and you feel like you're alone basically. And if you don't have money, you have zero support, and it's just it's a terrible place to live in, and a terrible space, terrible mental space to live in all the time.
I describe it in the book and just generally as this kind of palpable despair that I feel when I go home. And I felt it in my own life, but I feel it just everywhere I go. When I go back to the US, there's this real feeling of everyone being one step away, as you said, from something like homelessness, from losing their home, from losing their ability to access healthcare if they have that ability in the first place, from their children not being able to go to a school that's safe and that can provide them an education. These are all things that kind of get to the core problem, as I see it, in American society, which is that wealthy minority that I read about, uh, has access to sort of the best of everything, right? The best housing, the best healthcare, the best childcare, the best schools for their children, the best elder care. And yet, the majority of Americans, despite living in the wealthiest country in the history of the planet, have very little to limited access to those same things. And so, what I really wanted to understand as I lived in different places and actually traveled to 8 countries. One of them is one that I live in. I wanted to understand how it is that these issues that seem intractable in the US are essentially solved problems in other countries, and why we can't have the same at home.
Yeah. And I love that it's such a hopeful look at what is actually already being done and how it's been done. You give a lot of very concrete examples. So I want to get into the examples in the book, specifically the ones that really spoke to me because of my own experiences. But before we do, I actually wanted to also ask you because I was curious, how did you get into this work? So you talked about a little bit about coming from a background of two cultures, Iranian and Mexican, and also traveling, living abroad, and you've contributed to a lot of publications like LA Times, like The Nation, and others. So where do the origins of coming to this journalism storytelling work lie for you?
I've have always been a storyteller since a very young age. I remember from when I was a kid writing stories about, like, from the perspective of chewing gum when I was growing up in Chicago. That was my my first prize for a story when I was, like, I think 10 or 11 years old. And, so I was always really interested in the power of storytelling. And I think that as I got older and ended up working in journalism, I worked in a few publications, mainly a I was at Los Angeles Magazine for a while, and then also at Truthdig for 10 years, which is a progressive website. I started to consider how this aspect of storytelling can sometimes be absent from journalism.
Mm.
How policies, for example, can feel so foreign to us, and even when they're impacting our daily lives. And so I really wanted to translate, if you will, people's stories or pass them the microphone so that everyone could see for themselves, could hear for themselves that these are just everyday people who are benefiting from policies, that these are not sort of dry statistics or, language that's very legal, that feels like it's not really about us or isn't really going to impact us, even though it clearly does. And so that's kind of my approach to journalism in this book specifically, and a little more generally. I've always felt like my job as a journalist has been to make these kind of stories, these kind of ideas as accessible as possible to as many people as possible.
I can relate to a lot of what you're saying as well. Having a story, having this yearning for storytelling from a young age. I have to ask you, what was the story with the chewing gum?
So I think it was I told a day in the life of chewing gum, and everything from, the first moment it's unwrapped and going into someone's mouth and then being put underneath, a bench. I actually think the inspiration for it came this is a bit of a funny, silly story, but, when I was growing up in Chicago, we were taking the is it the L train? That's the yeah, I haven't lived there for a long time, so we were taking the L train with my younger brothers and I and my parents, and my youngest brother, who must have been like 4 at the time or something, he took a piece of chewing gum off of underneath a bench, and suddenly we turned around and everyone was like, "Where did you get that gum?" He was just chewing it, and he said, "Oh, underneath the bench." So there was a bit of panic in my family, and so I think that that little anecdote made it into the story and added some perspective, some humor.
I love that. I mean, that's the power of storytelling, right? It's a vehicle that allows us to travel places and consider things that we might not otherwise consider and see how it is for chewing gum to be stuck under the bench, which I love.
Yeah.
So that's a great segue actually to this book because that to me also what this book felt like. It felt like that vehicle. And for me as somebody who actually comes from places that you talk about in the book like Estonia, I grew up in Estonia. I'm very familiar with Finland and a lot of other places in the book. It was such an amazing also reminder of that hope because again, and I've talked about this publicly on the podcast, I haven't felt good being here in the States for a long time now. And I've actually tried leaving. I got a residency in Barcelona and I was going to go live there for some time, but some things didn't work out and I stayed here in Chicago. But yeah, that despair and when you're here and when you're in this soup, you're boiling in the soup, it's hard sometimes to remember that there are places that have solved this and that organize so much better than how we organize here. So it was a great reminder for myself. And then the next question comes, well, what do you do about it, right? For your own personal life, do you go there? Do you try to make your life better by going somewhere, or do you stay here and fight and stick it out, right? And that's a discussion that we can get into later. But first, let's get into the actual examples. So the first one that I really loved hearing about was Singapore. I absolutely loved learning about Singapore's public housing policy, and hearing tidbits that you mentioned in the book, like your conversation with Tai Care, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, who is considered to be the modern day architect of Singapore, learning that one of Singapore's presidents actually lived in public housing, or the fact that there is no such thing as foreclosure in Singapore, that absolutely blew my mind. That if you're unemployed in Singapore, you're not going to lose a roof over your head. That's you know out of science fiction for me.
Singapore is such an important example to me because I wanted to take a more global perspective on social democratic solutions. Oftentimes, when we talk about these kind of progressive policies, we talk about Scandinavia, and I did go to Scandinavia. You saw I went to Norway and Finland and a few other European countries, but I wanted to show that even in very different contexts, these kinds of policies have taken root and are very popular and very effective. And so Singapore, which is this very hyper capitalist country, I keep saying that it's like a even more pick yourself up by your own bootstraps than the US is in
I
many
didn't know that was
that
possible.
yeah, yeah. Well, even that, we still have public schools, thankfully, in the US, that are not fee charging, even though there's a real attempt to completely destroy that system, but we still have certain public services that are free at the point of delivery. And even in Singapore, even schools are fee charging. And so it is very much a very hyper capitalist society. And no one can really call it the sort of leftist utopia. And yet you have this very leftist idea, even though it doesn't come from the left in Singapore, or it wasn't implemented by the leftist government, in their public housing, which is this radical project that started in around the founding of the nation itself, and that today looks like 80% of Singaporeans living in high quality mixed income public housing, and 90% of them being homeowners. And exactly what you said about the foreclosures really blew my mind. It's that if you specifically have a public housing unit, which is from the Housing Development Board, HDB housing they call it, and you get this loan to buy the home from HDB itself, which is what we would have a mortgage for in the US and in other countries from a bank. You essentially are getting it through your own savings account, your own pension savings account. And so if you lose your job, and again, there's no unemployment insurance in Singapore, but there's this ability to talk to HDB and restructure your housing loan so that you do not lose your home during that time. And they'll do something like, the payments will just be added on, or a few years will be added on, or a few months, whatever amount of time you couldn't pay. But that means that if you do have public housing and you do have a loan through HDB, because you can get bank loans, most people don't for this reason, you don't have to worry about something as basic as losing your home at your time of need.
I'm just speechless, honestly. That's the power of this book, and the examples that it shows, right? Because again, it's like, I think it's so hard to see another reality when you're faced with the reality that you're faced with, and you almost accept it as fact, right? Foreclosure is a fact of life in the United States. It's a huge stressor. And so to think that actually, no, we can have a system in which there is no foreclosures, it's almost just like, what? It helps you break out of that shell of thinking that the way it is here is the way, it's the only way, and the way that it's always been, which is absolute myth. There is another book that I'm reading, and of course the title is slipping me right now, but in there they talk about how this idea of a nuclear family, two parents, two and a half, 2.5 kids, a picket fence, and a garage in the suburbia, we feel like it's such a standard. Yet it was an invention that was invented in the 50s and 60s in the States. And throughout human history, it wasn't actually how people lived. It's a very modern invention, but we feel it's so ingrained to us now that we feel like it's something that's always been done and that is the norm.
Yeah, that's a really interesting I mean, I don't write about this in the book. I write about paid parental leave, which I can talk about if you'd like, but it's a really interesting thing, this idea of nuclear family, and I think there have been studies done that show that the majority of even Americans don't live in this what you would consider a traditional nuclear family format. I certainly didn't grow up like that. I grew up in an intergenerational home with my mom's mom, my grandmother, really doing most of the caregiving and child rearing. And so I think that a lot of Americans, I think the majority, live in family units that look very different from that nuclear family. And yet, yes, it is something that we're supposed to, aspire to or that we're all supposed to fit into.
I kept thinking when I was reading the Singapore chapter that I would really love to go back to Singapore with this context now. Because I visited it in, I think, 2015 or so. And, I was just there for a couple of days. It was a very brief introduction to the city. And I saw those huge public housing buildings and those huge numbers on the walls, which is kind of an iconic symbol of Singapore. But I didn't really know the context behind it. So now I was like, okay, I need to come back to Singapore and with your book in tow and really just walk the streets again and understand that context more because it's just amazing the feat that they have done, right? To eradicate homelessness basically in the country, which is amazing.
Those buildings that you're talking about with the numbers, I mean, so a lot of the older, housing units, housing buildings look like that, but actually some of the newer ones you've probably seen look like these, like, gleaming skyscrapers and win architecture awards, and so there's been this real effort in Singapore to make public housing high quality
Mm.
and to detach that stigma that we have to public housing in a lot of places, including in Chicago, for example, where I grew up.
Yeah. That's an excellent point. I remember that as well. You make it a point to talk about that. There's so many examples of housing in Singapore. That's really excellent. And by the way, the other thing that I also loved is that you also don't skirt around the issues of different implementation issues in these countries, right? It's not like you're just presenting us sort of one side of the story. For example, in Singapore, you talk about the fact that gay people are not able to take advantage of public housing until the age of 35 because of their focus on the nuclear family, basically, and to support the traditional sort of nuclear family, which I thought was quite interesting as well.
Yeah, it was really important to me in every chapter to document the flaws as well as the positive aspects of every policy because that's how we learn from things, right? Like, I wouldn't want us to repeat the same mistakes in the US that have been done in Singapore or in Portugal or anywhere else. And so it's good to have these lessons. Like, we learn as much from failures as from successes, right?
So let's talk about the Nordics for a bit because I can't wait to get into the Nordics. And yes, like you said, the Scandinavia is always gets brought up as an example when people talk about progressive policies. But you've covered three places from the region: Norway, Finland, and Estonia, of course, which is where I'm from. And in Norway, you cover the family-friendly policies. We're not going to spend too much time on Norway because we want to leave stuff for listeners to actually go and pick up the book and get into themselves. There's one thing that you said in that Norway chapter that really, again, blew my mind. You say the US is the only OECD country without nationwide statutory paid maternity leave, paternity leave, or parental leave. And not only just OECD country, it's one of 7 countries on earth that doesn't provide paid maternal leave. What?
It's absolutely appalling that that's the case in, again, such a wealthy country, the wealthiest country. And it's more appalling when you consider how popular these policies are in the US. So something like 94% of Americans think that paid parental leave would be good for families. And so it's already something that people want and people agree with. And yet policy has not caught up with that, with popular opinion, with popular needs, really.
Which kind of gets us onto a tangent of how do you fix that, right? Like, it feels like And again, this is a conversation that could be a whole episode in itself, but something that I've felt for a long time is that also people are not very involved in politics in the US. At least that's kind of been my observation. And maybe that's by design because people are trying to survive because life is so hard and you're just so focused on paying the mortgage or paying rent and getting all those things that we discussed. But it's like a lot of times, politics is just like, oh, politics is not for me. I'm not political. I'm just trying to do my own thing. I guess I'm trying to see how you feel about it. Like it feels like we're almost left it up for, up for whatever. We are not dealing with politics. There are some people who are very activist and very involved on, on many sides of the spectrum. But I feel like the majority just doesn't. And maybe that's one of the reasons why we're in the pickle that we're in.
I definitely see I definitely see what you're saying, and it is certainly a problem that we have in the US that we don't really have these large movements that or when we do, for example, for like Bernie Sanders in the 2016 and 2020 campaigns, they kind of dissipate afterwards. Like we don't really know what to do with all of this popularity, but like people really believe in these things. They come out in the thousands, Bernie Sanders and now also Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are going on this like fight the oligarchy tour, and they're going to places that voted for Joe Biden in 2020 and then voted for Trump in 2024 and talking to people. And they're getting these huge crowds, like 34,000 people, I think was one of the
Mhm.
biggest ones. And the question is, what do you then do after the rallies, right? How do we come together and even though we agree and that we want this kind of vision, this more progressive vision for our country, how do we then fight for that vision? And I think a lot of what I try to do with this book is say, okay, we're not going to agree on everything. Like I don't expect anyone to agree with me on all of the 9 policies that I chose, even though I'm really passionate about all of them. But this is kind of how coalitions are built, right? Come together with people because you all think that Medicare for all, for example, is something that would be beneficial. I expect people to come to this book and be interested in, let's say, renewable energy transition
Mm.
and read the chapter on Uruguay and then become interested in paid parental leave in Norway. Or then, I would hope that they would stay for one more chapter if possible. And that is how I see us sort of building out these movements is that we can come together on certain issues and then hopefully come together on other issues as well and build this kind of platform, so to speak, that we can get leaders elected on and hopefully hold them accountable because that's the other problem, especially in the US, because we do not have a labor party that's accountable to a labor movement. You don't really have politicians who are accountable after they've been elected, and you'll see them shift and shift and shift. Not always, but it is often the case that that happens. Especially because of the way that money works in politics in the US. I really think that these like mass movements are going to be so important and they're already building. It's not just Bernie Sanders rallies. There are a lot of campaigns around the country for a lot of different issues. And one of the things that I found really heartening and is an example of why we can be hopeful that Americans are not just wanting change, but will fight for it and will vote for it and will get it passed is that you saw in the November general election, you had these like what we would consider deep red states and Missouri, Nebraska, and Alaska. They were among many states that raised the minimum wage, or a few of them were anyway. But those 3 states also passed paid sick leave on their ballots for the first time. And it just goes to show that even in these, like I said, deep red states, these ideas that we would consider progressive are popular, are taking hold, are getting passed. And so I think we're much closer in the US to a lot of these things than we realize because there is a lot of popular support. And I know right now it feels a little bit crazy to say that with how chaotic and terrible things are with the current administration sort of trying to rip up whatever we have left of a safety net. But I do think that this is a time for us to really re-envision what kind of policies make sense for our country because we will have to build and rebuild after this and even very soon, and on a local scale. So it's not the time to despair and put our hands up. It's the time to get to work.
I love that. I love that, Natasha. And I feel like you are such a perfect vessel for communicating that hope. I feel like you by yourself are a very optimistic person. It's funny when you were saying that and mentioning despair. It's a comment that my professor in school gave me 20 years ago when I was going for my bachelor's. English professor here. It was a poetry class, and I was writing an essay about Robert Frost, I think. I wrote the essay, and one of his comments was, Yulia, leave the deep despair of your Russian soul at home. Like, where did you see? Because I guess the way I analyzed it was like so tragic, the way that he wasn't even expecting, and so he's like, leave your Russian soul despair at home. So I know I tend to bring sometimes that kind of very gloomy, deep gloomy point on everything. But yeah, it's great. I love this conversation because it's important to remind myself even that, it's not always the case.
But it's also, I mean, it's so important to really have optimism that's based in fact. And that's
Yeah.
part of what I tried to do is that
Yeah.
I'm saying this is doable because it's been done. It's not something that we have to think of as a utopian idea because I've seen it in action. And yes, we can improve it. We can contextualize it for an American public, but it's already working. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. And so I really think of myself as a pragmatic optimist in that I really like to see things working before I say, yeah, this is a good idea. But also, I do want to point out, and as hard as it is in the States sometimes to feel like we're making this progress, we've had a long line of successes. So we've had civil rights movement successes, we've had labor movement successes over the history of the country, we've had LGBTQ rights successes. And so it's not like we haven't made progress or the anti war movement. These are movements that have succeeded, maybe not in their totality, maybe not with everything they wanted to do, but have had made significant gains. And so I really want us to remember that this isn't even the beginning of something. This is a continuation of a long tradition of Americans fighting for better.
So well said, and such an important reminder. Thank you for that, Natasha. In Finland, speaking of facts and speaking of, practical or pragmatic optimism, in Finland, you talk about the educational policies there. And it was so interesting for me because I just went to Finland after some time away last year. And actually, one of the conversations that I remember from my trip to Finland last year was that I spoke to this couple who were from Portugal and they moved to Finland. And, I was asking them, how's your life here? And the first thing that they brought up was the educational policy in Finland and how incredible it is and how it differs from anything that they've seen before, because they had two young kids who were in school. And so they were telling me how their kids spent much less time in school than they did in Portugal, that they have less homework. I think in your book you said on average 2.8 hours a week kids spend in homework versus 5 hours a week in America. And they walk, cycle to and from school. There's lots of breaks. Sounded like a very fun experience and something that's so interesting. And this is exactly what you cover in that chapter as well. So I thought that was so lovely.
It was wonderful to go to Finland's public schools and talk to the students and see what a great time they were having learning. I remember this like group, and I think they're in the book, this group of fifth graders that came up to me and they were so excited to talk to me about the US actually as well. But I was asking them about whether they like school, and they loved school and they were having so much fun. And I think that the key really to how Finland succeeded in having one of the highest performing educational systems in the world, despite again having very few resources and not really having the means, so to speak, to have this like incredible system at the beginning anyway. What they decided early on through their reforms in the late 20th century was that they were going to abolish private schools,
Mm.
and that elimination of the off-ramps that we were talking about that we have in the US, where if you're wealthy, you can get the best of things, but everyone else is kind of screwed, sorry to say. To eliminate those off-ramps meant that everyone was invested in making their neighborhood school the best possible school. You didn't have an option, and I think that that's really important. I'm a big believer in universal programs. I'm an even bigger believer in universal programs after writing this book. And Finland is a really good example of how bringing people together with universal programs is very effective in that the systems themselves become very beloved because they are so important to people's lives, but that they also build social solidarity. There's this activist, Robbie Nelson, who talks about engines of solidarity. And someone was saying to me that they see the policies in my book like that, like engines of solidarity, like policies that bring us together and show us we're all in this together. We really are. But in a very material, clear way, say, no, really, we have only each other. We have only our neighborhood school. We have only our healthcare system that belongs to all of us. And so we better fight to make it the best possible system.
Yeah, I love that. And, there is one passage that in that Finland chapter that I feel like illustrates that point so well. If I may just read it as well, because
Yeah,
I
please.
loved it. It says, parents I spoke to in New York City's playgrounds would say, my child deserves the best. And the part that America's forgotten is that that's not the end of the sentence, said the charismatic American producer with the wry smile of someone who's been let in on one of life's great secrets. By the way, I just love your phrases and your language in the book as well. It's so beautiful. There is a comma,
Thank you.
and the comma is what most parents here in Finland remember. My child deserves the best. So does everybody else's. I just love that passage so much.
Yeah, it's such a basic idea, but it really is the reason why Finland students are doing so well and routinely outperform American students. It's that it's an idea at the heart of everything that they do in the education system. Everyone deserves the best possible education system. You were talking about homework. I had so many moments where my mind was just blown away, and throughout the whole process of writing the book. But like in Finland, that happened multiple times, and one of those was about the homework and the way one teacher said to me, "Well, we would never assign something that we want them to learn at home on their own. That's the point of school. Like we're here to teach them things, and homework really is just to reiterate ideas so that they get practice. The students get practice." I thought, "Oh my gosh, I did so much homework where I had to do all of the learning on my own." And part of that is the way that unfortunately our education system in the US has move towards this test-based teaching. And it's so unfortunate because we have amazing teachers in the US. I know public school teachers. I went to public school myself in both in Illinois and in California. They were excellent. The teachers were excellent. The schools were excellent. And I know that it's possible in the US, but that slowly that's been eroded by policies that don't give teachers the autonomy to actually teach what they know. And that was another really frustrating, mind-blowing moment in Finland was that a lot of Finnish teachers were telling me a lot of these ideas actually come from the US. And yet we're able to implement them in our classrooms. And we see that American teachers are not because of how the education system has been designed in recent years, anyway.
Finland is such an interesting example on so many levels, right? Even uh, in the travel space, for example, which I'm very familiar with, Finland gets all the headlines once a year when the World Health Organization's happiness report comes out, because for 8 years in a row now, Finland has been scoring as the happiest country on earth. And I think that idea of autonomy and that idea of so does everybody else deserves the best has a lot to do with that, because as you say in the book, and also as I've heard from conversations I've had with Finns last year, like you said, they don't have a lot of resources. They do have their sisu, which is their sort of steadfastness and resourcefulness. And they do have actual nature as a big resource, but they don't use it as a natural resource to extract from. They use it as a resource to come and to rejuvenate in, which is such a different way to imagine it, right? But so yeah, it's I loved the example of Finland, and I think everybody should go and read that chapter. Right next to Finland is Estonia, which is where I'm from. And by the way, for our listeners, I met Natasha in person a few months ago. She was in Chicago for a book event, and When I learned, I didn't know much about your book before I came to the event. And when I learned that Estonia was one of the chapters, I was like, oh my God, I have to talk to Natasha. It's so lovely. Fun fact, in Estonia, you talk about this idea of internet and digital services being human rights, which is something that Estonia decided early on because after Soviet Union, they didn't have a lot. They basically had nothing, so they had to start from scratch. So immediately they started thinking about how do we bring Estonia into the 21st century. They were way ahead in many policies, ahead of the US and other countries, with their voting online, doing taxes online, public Wi-Fi availability. Like I left Estonia in the early 2000s, and it was already something that was, starting to happen over there years before everyone else. But here's the thing that I really was so excited to see in your book in your chapter on Estonia. I learned something about the town that I grew up in. So I grew up in Tartu, which you went and visited, which is amazing. And I learned in your book that there's a suburb of the town I grew up in. It's called Neo. And I know Neo very well. I had a few friends who came from Neo. And you say in the book that it was the first place in Soviet Union to have a computer in school in 1965. I did not know that fact. That was incredible to me.
Yeah. I mean, Estonia is such a wonderful place, and I love Tartu. I didn't realize you were from Tartu. Yes, so it was just a really great example of how you can use the internet for good. So there were a lot of I mean, they call it e-Estonia, this whole project, right? This all of these different digital services and digital rights that have been developed over the past few decades in Estonia. There were so many aspects of it that I loved, like you said, like voting online in a secure way, um, being able to petition your government online. I thought that that was wonderful. These ideas of like direct democracy, where you are able to communicate in the digital age, in the age of the internet in 2025, and I mean earlier in Estonia, with your elected representatives,
Yeah.
and ask questions, and also demand things and demand change. And I think that's really wonderful. One of my favorite parts was the citizen portal that I'm sure you're familiar with, in which you can access all public services and also some commercial services with your EID, but that every time you want to, for example, renew your driver's license, or let's say get paid parental leave payments because you've just had a child, which I know you have a great paid parental leave policy in Estonia as well, and actually a great public school education system as well. Those are
What am I
all
doing in the United States?
well, it is just this really great example of how sometimes the scrappiest solutions come out of very difficult periods, and also from places that don't have as many resources. And so there's less waste because it's not possible to waste, right? You have to kind of get on with things. And so the citizen portal, like I was mentioning in Estonia, just blew me away because the idea that you could access all of these services online, again, in a secure way in which your private data was not only kept securely and guaranteed by the government to be kept in that way, but also that you're able to see who accessed your private data at any point. I've talked a little bit about how, you know, Doge and Elon Musk keep try to get their hands on all of this really sensitive private data in the US and through like the Social Security Department and the Treasury Department and all of these different places. And yet in Estonia, I just don't think that would be possible because first of all, there's a lot of different reasons why. There's a lot of different policies in place to keep something like that from happening. Second of all, you have access to who is accessing this data. And so you personally can know if your privacy has been infringed upon by someone like Elon Musk. And so I think that these are all really great things to learn from in the US, and that we're so far behind. I mean, taxes, being able to do your taxes in a few seconds, even, I think is the record in Estonia, and for free, which it absolutely should be, instead of in the US where you have to go through one of these third party private companies like TurboTax or whatever. It just should be a no brainer. And yet, still in the US, again, because of the way that moneyed interests have worked and have worked against the people's best interests, we do not have these things.
Yeah, things that illustrates that so well in Estonia as well, which is you talk about in the book, is the idea that all the communications infrastructure is owned by the government. It's not owned by private companies, basically, which it is here in the States. Which again, like this muddling of private interest money in services that should be public and universal.
One of the big lessons, those lessons that I've collected in the end, is that we should have public ownership over private ownership as much as possible. I think there are aspects, just to say, there are aspects of the telecommunications infrastructure in Estonia that have been privatized. This happened like post-Soviet Union. So not all of it is publicly owned, but certainly there are laws that have required these companies to sort of act in the public's best interests and to treat the internet and access to internet like a right. And that again is very absent. And so you have these ideas of like net neutrality built into to the legal system in Estonia, that every time Trump gets back into power, it's under threat again. And I think it will, unfortunately, if it hasn't already, I haven't kept up with it, will lose net neutrality again in the US. That means again that certain services can pay to work better on the internet, to be more prominent on the internet. And that is a real loss to us as citizens of a society in which we depend on access to information, access to services online. And so I really want us to think as well how all of these different aspects of the internet can affect our daily lives, and how Estonia has understood that it's a space that we need protections in.
Which is actually a great point to bring us into this part of the conversation, that the 9 countries that you feature in the book. And by the way, I also love reading about Costa Rica. We don't have time to get into Costa Rica now, but please check out Natasha's book and check out the chapter on Costa Rica, because it's a country that, why I love it is because it's one of the few countries in the world that abolished the military, which is also another incredible program. But like all of these 9 countries that you talk about in your book, at the core of all of these 9 stories is this idea that the services like housing, like healthcare, like childcare, like internet are fundamental rights, not privileges, not commodities to make money on, and not something that's only accessible to those who can pay for it. They're necessary building blocks for human flourishing. And it's such a simple idea, but it gets so much resistance in the United States. But what really struck me in the end, as I was sort of reflecting on and thinking about all these stories that you brought to life, is that your work, your book, is another example of something that I'm calling a convergence, of something that's happening right now in this moment. Because I'm hearing this conversation from people from different backgrounds, different voices, different perspectives. They're all converging on this point and this realization that, especially in the US, but also in a lot of other countries around the world, the way we live, the way we organize right now in this very capitalist, very neoliberalist, individualist society is not working. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's a botanist and indigenous writer here in the States, and she wrote an essay called The Service Berry. It's an incredible, incredible essay. And in that essay, she talks about how her and a lot of people in her community understand that there are gifts of nature that we can all enjoy, that our system just keeps trying to want to commoditize and sell and make profit on, right? And the pickle that it's getting us in, right? And there are organizations like House of Beautiful Business that are also talking about poly opportunities versus poly crises that we have, right? So like very different perspectives, but all kind of converging in this moment right now, that hey, the way we live right now, it's not feasible for good flourishing human life. So how we can address it like bit by bit. So to me, that was the most like hopeful and amazing realization from your book, is that, there is a conversion right now. And I wonder how you feel about it, this moment.
I didn't expect when I started writing this book, or the proposal for this book, in 2020, before Trump lost the election. And as I wrote it, he was no longer in office, and now he's been reelected, and I just didn't expect to be talking about this book in such a dark period in US history. I would argue that things have been very difficult and getting darker and darker for many years, regardless of who was in the White House or who was in power. But this sense of brokenness that I see right now in the US feels a lot more in your face than it has possibly throughout my whole lifetime, in that Trump has a way of really kind of making ugly things about the US very undeniably ugly and very, very difficult to look away from. And so I do wonder if we're getting to this point of what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says, maybe this is the end of the broken way. Maybe we had to see, one, how broken things really were, but also that there were things that we were depending on. If they're going to cut Medicaid and Social Security, for example, which are the remnants of a safety net, it's going to cause a lot of harm. And these are things that perhaps people will start to see the government was actually doing for us with our collective labor, with our collective taxes, our collective money and resources. And so I'm kind of hopeful because I met you when I was on my book tour. I went to 8 US cities, and I kept having conversations like you're talking about, where people are really looking for a new way forward. And I think, as you said, it's a kind of natural, hopefully, endpoint of these many decades of neoliberal capitalist policy and thinking that has led us to the brink of destruction, or not even the brink, in many cases, destruction when it comes to the climate crisis. But I also know that a lot of the policies I looked at in the book come out of very dark periods in these countries' histories. And so you have the National Health Service in the UK, where I live, this first universal healthcare system in the world, coming out of the ashes of World War II. You have Estonia looking to the internet to rebuild its country at a time in which, again, it didn't have any resources. Uruguay looking to renewable energy at a point in which it was constantly being plunged into darkness because they couldn't keep the lights on. They couldn't afford to keep buying fossil fuels from neighboring countries at exorbitant prices. And so they had to look for a different solution. There are many examples like this in the book. And I want us to really hopefully come away from these lessons thinking dark periods can sometimes yield really great solutions. And so we cannot put our hands up in despair, as I said earlier, but put our hands to work and really think of this as a time in which, if more and more people are realizing that things are broken, they also are realizing that we need to fix them, that we need to chart a different path forward.
That's so beautiful. I love that, and I needed to hear it. It's a good reminder for me and so many others, I think. Put our hands to work instead of putting them to despair. And I also loved reading in your book that there are already examples in the US of people adopting some of these policies, right? You mentioned the San Jose and Hawaiian local politicians trying to pass public housing, Singapore style. You also brought the fact that Democrats attempted and got closer than ever before to pass universal parental leave recently, which I wasn't even aware of. So it's like chipping at it is something that's already happening. And that was a very important thing for me to hear as well.
Yeah, that was a really great part of writing this book, is that as I sat down to write about these policies, I found that a lot of Americans, and not just journalists like me, were also thinking and writing and working with these policies and getting inspired by them, even on a local political scale, and trying to adapt these same policies for a US context. Like you mentioned, in Hawaii and in California and San Jose, you have people who are saying, oh, look, Singapore is doing a great job with its public housing. We should do something similar. What can we do in Honolulu? What can we do in the state of California that can take the best ideas from Singapore and apply them to our country and to our states?
I'm curious, at the end of writing this book and visiting all these places and going on a book tour and having conversations with people, if you could choose one thing, to pick out one thing that gives you the most hope in this current moment, what would that be?
I grew up partly in the US, and I know that Americans are very strong and are actually very optimistic people. You've known from living there that we have a very can-do attitude, and I saw that throughout this trip, there is that willingness to get to work, that it's not just that people are frustrated, which they should be, and worried, which they should be, but also really eager to get to work and are already working in a number on a number of different fronts to fight for these kind of issues, to fight against the sort of onslaught of negative and destructive policies and things like this that we're seeing. And so that gave me a lot of hope to see that Americans, as I've always known them, are already doing the work that's necessary.
I love that. That's a beautiful and very hopeful note to close on. Thank you so much, Natasha. It was so lovely to talk to you today, and I hope to see you again in another place somewhere in the world. Before we close, which place are you going to next?
So I'm looking forward to writing another book that is part of the series. And so I will be going to quite a few different cities this time. As you saw in the book, I tried to go across countries as much as I could in the time that I was in them. But this time I'm going to focus a little bit more on cities and stay in one place at a time for a little while and see what they have to teach us. And hopefully one day also go home and live in the States again. And you talked a little bit earlier about staying and fighting, and it's something that actually I came away with from this last trip that I spent 5 weeks crossing the country. I would love to go back and participate in some way in person as much as I have sort of virtually, and also talk about the stories in the US that have been positive, that have been working. So hopefully there will be a second, a third, a fourth, fifth, who knows how many books in this series.
I love that. I love that so much, Natasha. We'll look forward to the second and third and fourth and how many more books from you. I will be following your work. It's such a joy to get to know you, to spend time with you, and to talk to you. And all the best to you in everything that you're doing.
Thank you so much, Julia. It's been wonderful.
Going Places shares stories that help us imagine a better way to live, create, and travel. We are located on the traditional unceded Anishinaabe homeland. Our lovely new theme music is Altercations by Matt Nicholson at Big Score Audio. Our editor is Luciana Boss. We are reader supported. Take care and safe travels.